ShadowDirector, Dissecting the DSM, Episode 7, The Order and the Inheritance. The police arrived at 2 in the morning, not because he was dangerous, not because he had harmed anyone, but because someone had called, had said he was a risk, had invoked the language of crisis, and in that moment the legal machinery activated. Emergency Custody Order, ECO, 4 letters that would strip him of rights, of agency, of personhood. Welcome to ShadowDirector, Dissecting the DSM. In our previous episodes, we explored how the DSM fragments experience into codes, how F31.9 became a profit center, how the system codes but doesn't treat, and what it actually feels like to be sedated and documented. Today, we're going deeper, into the legal mechanisms of involuntary commitment, into the intake process that shell shocks, into the Freudian psychology that underlies the system, and into how history, genetics, and physical characteristics become markers for targeting in the healthcare space. Let's start with the ECO, Emergency Custody Order. In most states, this is the first step in involuntary psychiatric commitment. A magistrate, a judge, or sometimes just a law enforcement officer can issue an ECO based on a petition that someone is a danger to themselves or others, or is unable to care for themselves. The standard is low. The evidence required is minimal. The process is fast. The ECO authorizes law enforcement to take the person into custody and transport them to a psychiatric facility. They're not under arrest, but they're not free either. They're in custody, but it's not criminal custody. It's medical custody, psychiatric custody, a liminal space where constitutional rights are suspended, where due process is delayed, where the person becomes a patient before they've been assessed, diagnosed, or treated. The police arrived, 2 officers. They were professional, courteous, but firm. They explained the ECO. They explained that he needed to come with them. They explained that this was for his safety, for the safety of others. They didn't explain that the ECO was based on minimal evidence, that the process was designed for speed, not accuracy, that once the machinery activated, it was difficult to stop. He went with them, not because he wanted to, but because he understood the alternative. Resistance would be documented. Resistance would be interpreted as evidence of danger, of lack of insight, of need for treatment. Resistance would justify force, restraint, sedation. So he went. He got in the car. He was transported to the hospital. And there, the intake process began. The intake process is designed to shell shock, not intentionally, perhaps, but effectively. The person arrives disoriented, frightened, often in crisis. They're immediately stripped of belongings, phone, wallet, keys, anything that could be used for self-harm or that represents connection to the outside world. They're given hospital clothes, paper-thin, ill-fitting, designed to remove identity, to make everyone the same, to erase individuality. Then the questions begin. Name, date of birth, address, insurance information. Do you have thoughts of harming yourself? Do you have thoughts of harming others? Are you hearing voices? Are you seeing things that aren't there? Do you use drugs? Do you drink alcohol? Have you been hospitalized before? What medications are you taking? What's your psychiatric history? What's your family history? The questions come fast, one after another, with little time to think, to process, to understand what's being asked or why. The person is still in shock from the ECO, from the police transport, from the sudden loss of freedom. They're trying to make sense of what's happening, trying to understand where they are, why they're here, what comes next. But the system doesn't wait. The intake must be completed. The assessment must be done. The code must be assigned. This is where the shell shock deepens. The person is vulnerable, disoriented, frightened. They're trying to communicate, to explain, to be understood. But the system isn't listening for understanding. The system is listening for symptoms, for codes, for billing opportunities. Every answer becomes data. Every response becomes documentation. Every word becomes evidence for or against commitment, for or against diagnosis, for or against treatment. The temporary detention order, TDO, follows the ECO. If the intake assessment determines that the person meets criteria for involuntary commitment, danger to self, danger to others, or inability to care for self, a TDO can be issued. This extends the custody, typically for up to 72 hours, sometimes longer. The person is now formally committed, legally detained, held against their will in a psychiatric facility. The TDO is supposed to include a hearing, due process, an opportunity to challenge the commitment, but in practice, these hearings are often perfunctory. The person may not have legal representation. They may not understand their rights. They may be medicated, sedated, unable to participate meaningfully. The hearing becomes a formality, a rubber stamp, a confirmation of what the system has already decided. This is the shell shock, the sudden loss of freedom, the stripping of identity, the rapid-fire questions, the legal machinery that moves too fast to challenge, the system that processes rather than understands. The person becomes a case, a file, a code. Their humanity is reduced to symptoms, to risk factors, to billing opportunities. Now, let's examine the Freudian psychology that underlies this system. Freud's work, developed in Vienna and later in London, was deeply influenced by German and French psychiatric traditions. The German tradition emphasized classification, categorization, the medical model of mental illness. The French tradition, influenced by figures like Charcot and Janet, emphasized observation, documentation, the clinical gaze. Freud synthesized these traditions, creating a system that pathologized human experience, that saw symptoms as evidence of underlying disorder, that treated the person as a case to be analyzed rather than a human to be understood. His concepts, repression, the unconscious, defense mechanisms, became tools for interpretation, for diagnosis, for treatment. But they also became tools for control, for authority, for the assertion of professional power over patient experience. The Freudian tradition, particularly as it was developed in German and French contexts, created a hierarchy. The analyst, the psychiatrist, the clinician had knowledge, authority, power. The patient had symptoms, resistance, pathology. The clinician interpreted. The patient was interpreted. The clinician diagnosed. The patient was diagnosed. The clinician treated. The patient was treated. This hierarchy persists in modern psychiatry. The DSM, with its codes and categories, is a product of this tradition. The intake process, with its rapid-fire questions and symptom-focused assessment, reflects this tradition. The involuntary commitment process, with its legal authority and clinical judgment, embodies this tradition. The person becomes an object of study, a case to be managed, a problem to be solved. But here's where history enters. The German psychiatric tradition that influenced Freud was also the tradition that, under the Nazi regime, became a tool for eugenics, for elimination, for genocide. The same classification systems, the same diagnostic categories, the same authority structures that were used to understand mental illness were also used to identify, to target, to eliminate those deemed undesirable. This isn't to say that modern psychiatry is Nazi psychiatry. It's not. but it is to recognize that the structures, the systems, the ways of thinking that underlie modern psychiatric practice have historical roots in traditions that were used for horrific purposes. And when those structures are applied without awareness, without reflection, without recognition of their potential for harm, they can become tools for targeting, for abuse, for the assertion of power over vulnerable people. The protagonist of our story is a third-generation Holocaust survivor. His grandparents survived the camps, the ghettos, the systematic attempt to eliminate them. They carried trauma, yes, but they also carried resilience, survival, the determination to live. That trauma, that resilience, that survival was passed down, not just through stories, but through biology, through epigenetics, through the ways that trauma shapes gene expression across generations. He also has a double MTHFR genetic mutation. MTHFR, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, is an enzyme involved in folate metabolism. Mutations in this gene can affect how the body processes B vitamins, how it produces neurotransmitters, how it handles stress. A double mutation, inheriting the variant from both parents, can create vulnerabilities to depression, to anxiety, to the effects of trauma, to the ways that medications are metabolized. He also has blue eyes. This might seem irrelevant, but in the context of targeting, of profiling, of the ways that physical characteristics become markers, it's not. Blue eyes, in certain contexts, can be read as markers of otherness, of difference, of something that doesn't fit. In the healthcare space, where unconscious bias operates, where profiling happens, where certain characteristics trigger certain responses, physical appearance matters. These factors, third-generation Holocaust survivor, double MTHFR mutation, blue eyes, become markers in the healthcare space. Not intentionally perhaps, but effectively. The trauma history becomes a risk factor, a vulnerability, a reason for increased monitoring, for more aggressive treatment, for more frequent hospitalization. The genetic mutation becomes a justification for medication, for polypharmacy, for complex treatment regimens. The physical characteristics become part of the clinical picture, part of the assessment, part of the documentation. But here's what the system doesn't see. The trauma history is also resilience. The genetic mutation is also adaptation. The physical characteristics are also just characteristics. The system sees risk, pathology, need for intervention. It doesn't see the whole person, the complex history, the ways that trauma and genetics and appearance interact in ways that can't be reduced to codes. The eco and TDO process, when applied to someone with this history, these characteristics, becomes particularly traumatic. The sudden loss of freedom echoes historical trauma. The stripping of identity echoes systematic dehumanization. The rapid-fire questions echo interrogation. The legal machinery echoes the machinery of persecution. The person isn't just being committed, they're being re-traumatized, their historical trauma activated, their vulnerabilities exploited. The intake process, with its focus on symptoms and codes, doesn't account for this. It doesn't recognize that trauma responses can look like psychiatric symptoms. It doesn't understand that genetic vulnerabilities can create presentations that seem like disorders. It doesn't see that physical characteristics can trigger unconscious bias. It just codes, documents, bills. The Freudian psychology that underlies the system, with its emphasis on interpretation and authority, becomes particularly problematic when applied to someone with this history. The clinician interprets. The patient is interpreted. But the interpretation doesn't account for historical trauma, for genetic factors, for the ways that trauma and biology interact. The interpretation becomes projection, assumption, the assertion of authority over experience. The comparison to the Nazi regime isn't about equating modern psychiatry to genocide. It's about recognizing that the same structures, the same systems, the same ways of thinking that were used for horrific purposes can, when applied without awareness, become tools for harm. Classification systems can become tools for targeting. Diagnostic categories can become tools for exclusion. Clinical authority can become tools for control. The slavery of targeted individuals isn't literal slavery, but it is a form of bondage. The person is bound by codes, by diagnoses, by legal orders, by treatment plans. They're bound by the system's interpretation of their experience, by the ways that their history and characteristics become markers for intervention. They're bound by the financial structures that reward coding over care, by the legal structures that prioritize safety over autonomy, by the clinical structures that prioritize symptoms over understanding. The protagonist, with his history, his genetics, his appearance, becomes a target, not because anyone intends to target him, but because the system is designed in ways that make targeting inevitable. The eco process targets people in crisis. The intake process targets people with symptoms. The diagnostic process targets people with certain presentations. And when those presentations are shaped by trauma, by genetics, by characteristics that trigger unconscious bias, the targeting becomes systematic. The shell shock of the intake process, when combined with historical trauma, becomes particularly devastating. The person isn't just being processed, they're being re-traumatized. Their trauma responses are being interpreted as psychiatric symptoms. Their genetic vulnerabilities are being used to justify interventions. Their physical characteristics are becoming part of a clinical picture that doesn't see the whole person. The system codes, documents, bills, but it doesn't see. It doesn't understand. It doesn't recognize that the person in front of it carries not just individual trauma, but historical trauma, not just personal vulnerability, but genetic vulnerability, not just symptoms, but the complex interaction of history, biology, and experience. The mystery deepens. Why does the system target? Why does it shell shock? Why does it fail to see the whole person? Part of the answer is structural. The way the system is designed, the way it processes, the way it codes. Part of the answer is historical. The traditions it inherits, the structures it uses, the ways of thinking it employs. Part of the answer is financial. The incentives that reward coding over care, volume over understanding. But part of the answer is also about power, about authority, about the ways that clinical judgment, legal authority, and diagnostic categories combine to create systems of control. The ECO and TDO process isn't just about safety, it's about control. The intake process isn't just about assessment, it's about documentation. The diagnostic process isn't just about understanding, it's about coding. And when that control, that documentation, that coding is applied to someone with historical trauma, with genetic vulnerabilities, with characteristics that trigger bias, the harm is multiplied. The person isn't just being processed, they're being targeted, bound, enslaved by a system that sees codes but not people, symptoms but not experience, risk but not resilience. The solution requires recognizing this, seeing how history shapes the present, understanding how genetics interact with trauma, recognizing how physical characteristics can trigger bias, demanding that the system see the whole person, not just the codes. But until that happens, the cycle continues. ECO, TDO, intake, coding, billing, discharge, return. The machinery grinds on, processing people, targeting the vulnerable, shell-shocking the traumatized. Thank you for joining us. The ECO and TDO process, the intake that shell-shocks, the Freudian psychology that underlies it, the historical parallels, the ways that history and genetics and appearance become markers for targeting. These are all part of the larger story. The system codes, but it doesn't have to. We can demand that it also sees, that it also understands, that it also recognizes the whole person, not just the codes. Until next time, remember, the codes have power, but understanding them is the first step toward reclaiming agency. The system targets, but we can demand that it also sees. The shadow remains, but it no longer has to dictate the terms of existence.